but we shouldn't be raising taxes when it comes to tariffs and other things, when that's just going to hurt the people we're trying to help the most at the bottom of the income ladder, and it's also going to distort the overall economy. This is not a good situation. Let's leave tariffs off the table and let's focus on pro-growth measures instead. Hello. Welcome to this week's economy. I'm your host, Dr. Vance Ginn. I hope you're having a prosperous day. Well, welcome back. Here in episode 78 of this week's economy, I'm going to discuss the presidential debate, elevated inflation, overspending in public education, high housing prices, and much more, while noting how pro-growth policies are needed to let people prosper, right? Remember, you can watch this episode on YouTube, listen to it on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, wherever you get it, and also check out my website at vanceginn.com. Number one that I want to talk about today is debate proves big government is the problem. In the news, Kamala Harris is positioning herself to compete with Donald Trump on economic issues, focusing on subsidies, tax credits, and price controls aimed at middle-class voters. Her proposals include a $6,000 tax credit for new parents, while his includes a $5,000 one, subsidies for first-time home buyers by her, and price controls on groceries by her as well. Harris's approach aims to counter Trump's economic record, but risks further driving up costs in a high inflation environment, which I'll get into more of that in a minute. But look, my perspective on this is that in the debate, there was a lot of discussion, a lot of back and forth and political bickering, but not much about policy. Especially me as a policy wonk, I'm looking for key policies and having some discussion about this. And unfortunately, the moderators didn't do a good job of pitching those types of questions and getting them to discuss it. But of course, they didn't bring up a lot of it as well, as they were basically just going out and throwing barbs at one another instead of focusing on the key issues that are facing Americans. Look, 58% of Americans believe that we're in a recession now. We see inflation that keeps ratcheting up. All these things are a bad situation for many Americans, and yet there are two main candidates who are not talking about this. And I hope that they do soon. And a big thing they didn't talk about, of course, was spending. Spending is a big part of this, with government spending way too much. We need sustainable budgets instead and allow for market forces to work over all this government intervention in the economy. So look, I think it was a bad debate overall, really, for both of them. Harris might have won to some extent, but at the end of the day, this was bad for Americans because we're not seeing good policies being discussed. Number two today is Fed must tackle elevated inflation first. In the news, the latest CPI report shows that while inflation has moderated, it's still running high. Headline inflation is up 2.5% year over year, and core CPI inflation, which excludes food and energy that we all buy, of course, remains at 3.2%. This signals that inflation pressures are persistent, particularly in key sectors like housing and services. The Federal Reserve is expected to announce its next interest rate decision on Wednesday, with inflation a pressing concern. Speculation is growing about whether the Fed will cut rates, but many worry this could fuel further inflation. Jerome Powell, who's Federal Reserve Chairman, will hold a press conference following the decision. So with all this done, my perspective and my take on this is that we have inflation that's still too high. And the Federal Reserve, which of course they like to look at the PCE inflation, which is different than the CPI inflation that was reported last week, and still shows high numbers. But at the end of the day, inflation is still hot all around us. It's growing faster, or at least year over year, it's up more than the 2% rate target that they would like to see before they would want to start cutting interest rates, increasing the money supply, and other things. The reason for the higher interest rates is really to suck out the money supply out of the economy, which they've been doing some of that, but now it's starting to come back up again. So I see inflationary pressures that are still all around us, and the affordability crisis is still hurting Americans, whether it be in housing, property taxes, and other things, because of the excessive spending by Congress that's given the ammunition more to the Fed to print more money. So we need to get away from this, and the Fed should be cutting its balance sheet, not cutting interest rates this week. That's what I say. So number three to talk about today is capital gains tax hike kills growth. In the news, Kamala Harris has proposed increasing the capital gains tax to 28%, a significant jump from the current rate. Bernie Sanders, Senator Sanders, has voiced support for even higher taxes, arguing that taxing wealth is essential for addressing income inequality. Critics worry that these higher taxes will discourage investment and hurt the economy. Look, Senator Sanders and Vice President Harris, they're both basically socialists, big government socialists. So they want to, quote unquote, tax the rich in order to pay for their big government spending policies. The problem is that you run out of other people's money, as Margaret Thatcher liked to say. And that's exactly what will happen here. When you raise taxes, especially on capital gains, what happens? happens? You get less of it, less of investment, less of innovation, less growth for the future, at exactly the time when we need more of that and more productivity for higher wages and more economic growth. So this is backward thinking. This is not the direction we should be heading, especially when we're trying to be more competitive on a global playing field. And so I think these ideas should be rejected and should not go forward. And of course, Congress has to pass these. No president can make these actions on their own. And so this is something that should be rejected at the end of the day. Number 4, Trump's tariff threat harms Americans. In the news, Donald Trump has proposed imposing 100% tariffs on countries that abandon the US dollar as the world's reserve currency. Trump argues that maintaining the dollar's dominance is crucial to the US economy, but critics point out that high tariffs would raise consumer prices and damage global trade relations. Of course, my perspective is that I'm a free trade guy. I think that we don't need tariffs. We shouldn't be raising taxes at the same time that he's trying to promote lower taxes by extending the Trump tax cuts, lowering the corporate income tax rate. I think those are pro-growth policies that should be met with spending restraint as well to fund them over time. But we shouldn't be raising taxes when it comes to tariffs and other things, when that's just going to hurt the people we're trying to help the most at the bottom of the income ladder. And it's also going to distort the overall economy. This is not a good situation. Let's leave tariffs off the table and let's focus on pro-growth measures instead. Number 5, government spending distorts markets. In the news, federal funding expires at the end of the current fiscal year on September 30th, raising the risk of a government shutdown. While Congress is considering continuing resolution to avoid this, the White House has indicated it would veto such a measure, pushing for more federal spending in key areas. Look, government spending distorts the economy. I know there's this idea that it can stimulate the economy, and there's this Keynesian approach that it could fill gaps and everything else. But look, that's all nonsense. At the end of the day, government has to take money from some to give to other people. So it's a redistribution scheme through the government, through political and unelected bureaucrats, not from the productive private sector where you have well-functioning markets and prices directing resources instead. That's really what we want more of. And so government spending just creates distortions throughout that entire process. And we've got to figure out a way to reduce government spending, cut government spending, because we're spending way too much. And yes, we have a big fiscal cliffs that are coming up, whether that be the budget debt ceiling, the amount of the budget that's already been passed, and then the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act expiration next year as well. All these things are important. What I hope Congress can do, and I'm talking to all you congressmen and women, is to make sure that you can find cuts within the budget. Then we're on an unsustainable path. We need sustainable budgeting. And the way to do that is by spending less. No amount of tax revenue is going to be enough. We don't have a spending problem. We have a revenue. We don't have a revenue problem. We have a spending problem. And I'll say this until I'm blue in the face, and we'll continue to, because we've got to focus on government spending and have sustainable budgeting and hopefully restraint with the spending limit. Because look, what we want to do is make it profitable for politicians to do what's in the best interest of people, not themselves, which they're likely to do more of. And I think if we could do that, we'd be in a much better course across the country. Number 6, housing crisis rooted in overregulation. In the news, the U.S. has experienced a widespread housing affordability crisis driven by restrictive local regulations, zoning laws, and supply chain issues. These barriers have made it difficult to build new housing, leading to skyrocketing home prices and rents. Some even question whether home ownership should remain a part of the American dream. Look, everyone has a different American dream. I don't think there is the American dream. So trying to push home ownership on people who can't afford it, who otherwise would want to do something else. Maybe they have bad credit. Maybe they want to rent. Maybe they're moving around more often, so they don't want to buy a home. So pushing us into that direction by government is social engineering. That is not a role for government. They should be getting out of the way, whether it be federal, state, or local regulations and zoning laws, reducing minimum lot sizes and things of that nature. That would allow us to have more supply of housing to keep up with the demand. There was a lot of changes in the demand and supply issues during COVID and thereafter, people moving, flexible work schedules, working from home, supply chain issues. Some of those things have cleared the markets now, but now we're dealing with a lot of other problems that's going on in the housing market. And so we need to figure out what's happening. I still think we have a housing market bubble that's ready to burst, but a lot of people are locked into their homes because of the high interest rate, where if they sell, they're going to lose their low interest rate and have to go buy at a higher interest rate and a higher valued home. So they're probably going to get less house or less property. And so a lot of them don't want to leave yet. When we start seeing the markets clear, we're going to see a lot more movement in the marketplace, and that's going to be coming pretty soon. But until then, we're going to have to deal with a lot of the higher housing prices and everything else because government failures along the way. Number 7, Texas overfunds public education. In the news, a recent report claims Texas has underfunded public education by 12.6%, which was my report, by the way, from 2016 to 2025, when adjusted for state population growth and inflation. Right. So, this report was by the Legislative Budget Board. They showed that it was down 12.6% because of state population growth and inflation. However, this measure may be misleading. It is misleading as it does not account for actual student attendance, which paints a different picture. Using average daily attendance, which is basically what they use for the school finance formulas in Texas. They use the weighted average daily attendance, but close enough. Rather than state population, right? Because those are two different measures. The state population is increasing rapidly, whereas the average daily attendance, it hasn't increased nearly as fast. So they have different denominators now when you're trying to adjust those nominal variable, the amount, total amount spent on education. When you adjust for all these things and look at average daily attendance and inflation instead of state population growth and inflation, you find that Texas has increased spending by 12.3% during this period. So it's not a 12.6% decline, it's a 12.3% increase. And so this is a massive amount of money. And if you look at the scores like 8th grade tests on math and reading and some other ones, those scores are down about 20% over the last decade or so. So we're seeing more spending in inflation adjusted, students adjusted terms, and seeing reductions in output. This is a bad return on investment. It's one reason why I don't think that it should be called public schools, because there's not a public externality that's benefiting those around them, especially in today's terms. This is all about funding a government monopoly school system. And we've got to get away from that. And the way to do it, right, is universal education savings accounts, where Texas could even save about $20 billion a year if done correctly, which I think they need to do. So let's get away from this idea that we're underfunding public education. We're overfunding it if you think about it in these terms, and instead look at ways that's going to help empower parents, students, teachers, and taxpayers, and that's universal school choice. So in conclusion, thank you for joining me in this week's episode of This Week's Economy. For more insights, visit vanceginn.com or go ahead and get a paid subscription to my Substack newsletter at vanceginn.substack.com so you receive these insights in your inbox whenever they come out. So God bless you and let people prosper.